Welcome back to
Bible Contradictions? Question mark.
Well, this episode, we have yet another unbeliever claiming there's contradictions in the Bible. Pastor Trenton, what do you think about this?
Hey, thanks, Jim. Well, you have presented a perceived problem. However, there are many scriptural solutions that will provide clarity and help the cloudiness of your confusion to dissipate. So, your perceived problem here, in Matthew 5:22, Jesus says, "Whoever says, 'You fool,' will be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." Yet in Matthew 23:17, Jesus himself calls the scribes and Pharisees fools. Is that a contradiction? Well, I'm surprised you only used those two verses, actually, because there's more you could have used. For example, Apostle Paul called the Galatians foolish, Galatians 3, verses 1 and 3, and apparently he even called someone a fool in 1 Corinthians 15:36. In addition, James apparently calls someone a foolish fellow in James 2:20. So, did the apostles end up in the fiery hell? Did Jesus himself end up in the fiery hell? Well, here's the solutions. So, first and foremost, there are good reasons why there is a strong difference between the two uses of the term fool. Now, this is another example of the principle that the same word can be used with different meanings in different contexts. So, for instance, the word dog can be used of a canine animal or a detested person. Now, we must examine Matthew 5 in proper context. In Matthew 5, the word under examination is used in the context of someone who is angry with his brother, indicating hatred. Neither Jesus, Paul, nor James harbored hatred toward those to whom they applied the term. Thus, their use of the term fool does not violate Jesus' prohibition against calling others a fool. Now, technically speaking, Jesus only commanded that a brother not be called a fool, not an unbeliever. Now, that English word brother is the Greek word adelphos, which would be someone from the same parent and by implication a fellow believer. Now, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? Is it not those who do the Father's will? Right? So, in fact, the scriptural description of a fool is one who has said in his heart, "There is no God." Now, in view of this, one can see the seriousness of calling a brother a fool. It is tantamount to calling him an unbeliever. So, that would be judging his or her heart, character, and faith. Now, in Matthew 7:26, Jesus told the people, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand." Now, if you read this in its proper context, you'll discover that the house, it will collapse because there's no foundation. And Christ is the rock who is the foundation. The Pharisees and scribes were fools because those who are truly the family of believers are also doers of the Father's will. Yet the Pharisees and the scribes, well, they did the opposite of the Father's will. And this is why in Matthew 5:20, Jesus said, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." But what exactly does it mean to do the Father's will? Well, as it turns out, I wrote an article on that. It has a lot of detail. In context, within the parable of the 10 virgins, Matthew 25:2 says, 5 of them were foolish and 5 were prudent. So, who do the 5 foolish represent? Well, as it turns out, I wrote an article on that. There's a lot of detail on that. So, in context within the parable of the rich man who stores up treasure for himself, God calls the greedy man a fool for storing up treasure for himself and not being rich toward God. And this is exactly what the Pharisees and scribes were guilty of doing. Now, further, we must remember that Jesus is God, and the Lord knows the hearts and the minds of people. Hence, when he who knew what was in man called unbelievers fools, well, it was a most appropriate and accurate description of who they truly were. Now, that is, of course, if I can provide scriptural evidence that Jesus is God. Well, hey, as it turns out, I wrote an article on that. There's a lot of detail on that. Therefore, Jesus never contradicted himself. Okay, but what about his disciples? I mean, after all, they weren't God. Did they contradict Jesus? Well, let's examine the ones that were cited. So, Galatians 3, verses 1-3. So, Apostle Paul called the Galatians foolish. But again, we must examine those verses in proper context. Now, did Paul say this to Adelphos? Yes. But was he condemning them, judging them, and calling them unbelievers? No. In fact, he only wrote to them because he knew they were believers. However, Paul did state that they were acting foolish because they had allowed themselves to be deceived by false teachers who convinced them to fall back into relying on the works of the law. So Paul's letter was truth written out from love in order to remind them that everyone who is under the law is under a curse because no one can abide perfectly by the law. It's impossible. And that's why Paul reminded them of how they first came to know Christ and received the Spirit, which was through faith. And because Paul even ended his letter to the Galatians by calling them brothers and calling on Christ to give them grace, Paul never called the Galatians a fool in a way that would bring condemnation on himself. In 1 Corinthians 15:36, well, you'll see that Paul only called a hypothetical person a fool, not a real person. And the purpose in doing this was to highlight how a foolish person would act. Again, Paul never condemned anyone, judged their eternity, or called them unbelievers, making an unrighteous judgment on their hearts and their character. In proper context, Paul was teaching believers about the resurrected body, and he was including them as part of those who will receive resurrected bodies. And yet again, Paul concludes his letter that his love through Christ is with them. Therefore, Paul never called the Corinthians a fool in a way that would bring condemnation on himself. Well, what about James? Okay, in James 2:20, well, again, James also only called a hypothetical person a fool, not a real person. And again, the purpose of doing this was to highlight how a foolish person would act. In this scenario, a foolish person would assume that faith without works is still true faith. However, James is clear. True faith naturally produces works. Why? Well, because genuine faith always produces fruit. And this is why Jesus said that a tree is known by its fruit in Matthew 12:33. So as it turns out, I wrote an article on that. And there's a lot of detail in that. And finally, I'll end with this. 1 Corinthians 1:18 says, "The word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing." I mean, after all, the definition of a fool is the person who says that there is no God. So, even if I called you a fool, it would be an appropriate and accurate description of who you currently say you are. But if you were a fellow believer, and I called you a fool and I judged your heart and your character, condemning you as an unbeliever simply because we disagree on a minor issue, well, then I would bring condemnation on myself. But as it is, you are the one who currently claims there is no God. And so whether you like it or not, the title of fool is what you claim. However, I do pray that you will seek the Lord with all your heart, all your mind. Look, many people are willing to ask questions and or bring forth critical claims of contradictions, but not many people are truly willing to seek the answers to the questions they ask and challenge their own beliefs. Scripture always interprets Scripture, and this investigation into your claim of contradictions reveals that, well, while it's an apparent contradiction, it's not an actual contradiction. May the Lord reveal himself to you, just as he did for me when I had been an atheist. May the Lord reveal to you the depth beyond the surface. You are loved, and Christ did die for you. But will you accept the free gift? Back to you, Jim.
Well, there you have it. Another apparent contradiction, but no actual contradiction. We'll see you next time.
Bible contradictions? Question mark?